Picture this. A movie studio hands a filmmaker a list of cuts. Trim the politics, trim the nudity, or there's no release. Most men would fold. Tom Laughlin didn't. He simply took the sound reels of his own film and walked out, leaving Hollywood holding a silent movie. That film was Billy Jack, and it would turn Tom Laughlin into a legend, a millionaire, and eventually a man who lost nearly everything he built. This is the story of a Milwaukee kid who punched his way out of college, married the love of his life on a South Dakota reservation, and spent the rest of his days proving that losing your fortune doesn't mean losing your nerve. Thomas Robert Laughlin, Jr. was born on August 10, 1931, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Margaret and Thomas Laughlin. Even as a teenager, he had a habit of running headfirst into trouble. At Washington High School, an athletics controversy — he'd been forced to attend a different school for a stretch, which made him ineligible to play football back home — became citywide news. It was the kind of scandal that would follow a lesser man for life. Laughlin shrugged it off, came back, and kept playing. He carried that same fighting instinct to college. He played safety and halfback first at the University of Wisconsin, then at Marquette, where, depending on who you ask, his temper finally caught up with him. He was expelled his sophomore year after a fight, the kind of exit that tends to end a young man's prospects rather than launch them. But Laughlin's story was never going to follow the ordinary script. Somewhere along the way, everything changed for him in a theater seat. He watched a production of A Streetcar Named Desire, and something clicked. A university professor, Father John J. Walsh, noticed the spark and nudged him toward the drama program. Laughlin ran with it. He formed his own stock company and directed and starred in Arthur Miller's All My Sons while still a student. Not bad for a young man who'd just been shown the door for brawling. He eventually landed at the University of South Dakota, majoring in radio, acting, directing, and producing, basically deciding he'd rather run the whole show than wait for someone to cast him in it. And it was there, on the plains of South Dakota, that Tom Laughlin met the woman who would change the entire direction of his life, Dolores Taylor. Dolores Taylor was born in Winner, South Dakota, on September 27, 1932, and grew up near an Indian reservation. As a young woman, her heart was actually set on graphic design, not acting. But love has a way of rewriting career plans, and once she and Tom Laughlin found each other at university, their futures became permanently tangled together, on screen and off. They married on October 15, 1954, and here's the detail that quietly explains the next 60 years of Tom Laughlin's life. That same year, freshly married, he wrote the original screenplay for Billy Jack, inspired directly by what he'd witnessed regarding the treatment of Native Americans in his wife's hometown of Winner. Think about that for a second. The film that would define his career and make him a fortune was written 17 years before it ever reached a theater. That's not ambition, that's obsession with a purpose. While Billy Jack sat in a drawer, Laughlin took the long road through Hollywood's back door. He started on television in 1955's Climax, then picked up small roles in These Wilder Years, Lafayette Escadrille, and, in 1958, a genuinely memorable turn as Navy pilot Lieutenant Buzz Adams in South Pacific. A year later, he showed up as Loverboy in Gidget. Yes, that Gidget, the one your granddaughter has probably never heard of, but her grandmother absolutely swooned over. In 1957, he landed his first true starring role in Robert Altman's The Delinquents, playing a teenager who spirals into trouble with a gang after being forbidden from seeing his girlfriend. It became a cult favorite, reportedly a personal pick of Alfred Hitchcock himself. But the shoot wasn't exactly a friendship-forging experience. Laughlin and Altman clashed constantly over how a scene should be acted. Two strong-willed men who simply saw filmmaking through different lenses. Somewhere, a fly on the wall of that set is still telling stories. It would be easy to tell this story as if Dolores Taylor were simply the supportive wife standing off camera, and that would be doing her a real disservice. When the Billy Jack series finally took off, she stepped into the role of Jean Roberts, Billy Jack's partner, and the head of an alternative school for troubled and at-risk kids, and played her across all 4 films, from The Born Losers through The Return of Billy Jack. Jean wasn't a decoration. She was a strong, outspoken woman who ran her own institution, stood toe-to-toe with corrupt officials, and refused to back down, at a time when very few leading women on screen were written that way. The role earned her a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actress in a Drama, and in 1996, she was inducted into the South Dakota Hall of Fame, a fitting tribute to a girl from Winner who grew up watching injustice up close and spent her career doing something about it on screen. She also co-produced The Master Gunfighter alongside her husband, proving the partnership went well beyond acting credits. When Tom kept working through the 1980s, Dolores made the choice to step back from acting altogether, dedicating herself instead to her family and to philanthropy. She'd already said everything she needed to say through Jean Roberts. Here's where Tom Laughlin proves he was never just an actor waiting for his big break. He was a man who kept building entire second careers on the side, almost for sport. In 1959, he and Dolores founded a Montessori preschool in Santa Monica. By 1961, he was so committed to it that he walked away from acting entirely to run the school full-time. And it worked spectacularly. By 1964, it had grown into the largest Montessori school in the entire United States, profiled by Time magazine as a genuine phenomenon in early education. One of its students was young Christian Brando, son of Laughlin's friend Marlon Brando, which tells you the kind of company the Laughlins were keeping by then. Then, in 1965, it collapsed, bankrupt, gone. If you're looking for the pattern of Tom Laughlin's entire life, this is where it starts. Build something from nothing, pour everything into it, watch it succeed beyond reason, and then watch it slip through his fingers anyway. Most people would take that lesson and play it safe for the rest of their lives. Tom Laughlin took it as a dare. In 1967, Laughlin wrote, directed, and starred in The Born Losers, a low-budget motorcycle gang picture that became a genuine box office hit. Buried inside it was a half-Navajo, ex-Green Beret drifter who defends a group of young women from a violent biker gang. Audiences couldn't shake him. Billy Jack was born. 4 years later, in 1971, Laughlin brought Billy Jack back for what would become the defining film of his life. American International Pictures agreed to distribute it until they actually watched it. The studio wanted the political content trimmed and the nudity cut, or there'd be no release at all. Most filmmakers negotiate. Laughlin and his wife simply withheld the sound reels. effectively turning their own movie into a silent film, rather than let a studio water it down. Eventually, he struck a deal with Warner Brothers instead, but he hated how they were marketing it, sued his own distributor, and in 1973 re-released the film himself. It was messy, it was combative, and it worked. The film became a phenomenon, embraced by a generation of young Americans who saw something of themselves in a man who refused to compromise. Laughlin himself put it best in 1975 when he said, "The youth of the country had only two heroes, Ralph Nader and Billy Jack." Adjusted for inflation, Billy Jack would go on to become, as of 2007, the highest-grossing independent film ever made. Not bad for a silent film gamble that could have ended his career overnight. Here's a story that never made it into the history books, but Laughlin told it himself, and it's the kind of thing that gives you goosebumps. His daughter, the same little girl who, at just 10 years old, wrote the song about a brother lost in war that plays in the film, had a favorite hat. It started as nothing special. One Halloween, kids used to spray silly string and brothered each other's hair, so to protect her beautiful blonde hair, she'd picked up a cheap little tax from the dime store. Tom Laughlin saw that hat and became fixated. "I have to have that hat," he told his own children, who, in his words, thought their father had lost his mind. He was exposing in the fiction anyway, and it became part of Billy Jack's iconic silhouette. Then, during filming, a Native American advisor mentioned that what the production was depicting resembled the real ghost dance religion, a securities movement started by a man named Wovoka. Laughlin tracked down the last living local Recepta cross-seconds lineage, an elderly man named Andy Vidovich, living alone in Nevada, who was so afraid of flying that his own son, a decorated World War II pilot, had never words gotten him on a plane. Laughlin called him NBA. Somehow, the old van got on that flight. When Vidovich finally arrived, dressed in an old brown suit, people out of privacy to show Laughlin who Wovoka really was. In the photograph, Wovoka was rubbing the exact same tax. Laughlin never fullering explained that one. Maybe some stories aren't meant to be explained, just told. The world voting those 6-something regarding a cross-pass to him once, and you because of the book of books on his face when Chris.
The trial of Billy Jack arrived in 1974 and was by any measure a massive commercial success, even as critics sharpened their knives over its heavy-handed politics. It tackled Native American rights, police violence, and the trial of a man the establishment desperately wanted silenced, turning what could have been a simple courtroom drama into a full-blown examination of the country's mood at the time. Laughlin, fresh off his war with AIP, settled with the studio for roughly $2 million that same year, the cost, in a sense, of doing things his own way. It's worth pausing here to appreciate what made the whole series stand apart. These were films built on non-professional actors, unpolished dialogue, and rough, unglamorous cinematography, the opposite of the glossy studio product audiences were used to. And running through every single one of them was Billy Jack's identity as half Navajo, a heritage that shaped every decision the character made. The films leaned hard into the real struggles Native communities faced: land theft, forced assimilation, quiet discrimination, while also making sure audiences saw the richness of the culture itself, not just the hardship. Some critics accused the films of oversimplifying complicated issues, and there's a fair argument there, but nobody could accuse Tom Laughlin of staying quiet about them. In 1975 came The Master Gunfighter, a western about the plight of the Chumash people, with Laughlin sporting a full beard and fighting his way through the film with both a revolver and a samurai sword, an odd, almost operatic combination that critics found ridiculous and audiences found reasonably entertaining. Two very different reactions, same movie. Then in 1977, Billy Jack Goes to Washington, Laughlin's homage to Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, a film he'd long admired. Billy Jack is appointed to the U.S. Senate and takes on a corrupt political system with his usual mix of restraint and righteous fury. It should have been his crowning achievement. Instead, distribution problems sank it, and it became his final theatrical release as a director. The empire he'd built one stubborn decision at a time had just taken its first real hit, and it wouldn't be the last. By 1984, Tom Laughlin was a man at war with the industry that once made him rich. He purchased 12 advertisements in Variety, publicly condemning Hollywood's treatment of independent filmmakers. He drew up an ambitious blueprint to give independent films control over home video distribution, a plan decades ahead of its time, and one that ultimately failed to get off the ground. Then in 1985, he began what he hoped would be his comeback, the return of Billy Jack, with the character now fighting child pornographers in New York City. During filming, Laughlin suffered a serious concussion and neck injury. Production was suspended. While he recovered, the money dried up completely, and the film was never finished. Not shelved, not delayed, simply gone. A permanent, unfinished chapter that haunted him for the rest of his life. He was still trying to find funding for it as late as 1996, during, of all things, a lawsuit against a man who had illegally changed his own legal name to Billy Jack. This is the part of the story that earns the phrase, "lost everything." Decades of self-financing, self-distributing, and self-litigating had drained him. The school was long gone. The video distribution dream had collapsed. His final creative vision sat forever incomplete on a shelf somewhere. A man who had once out-negotiated Warner Brothers was now fighting to reclaim the name of the character he'd invented from a stranger who thought that name was simply there for the taking. There's something almost poetic and deeply sad about that image, the creator decades later having to prove in a courtroom that he was still legally himself. And yet here's the part of Tom Laughlin's story that ought to make every one of us sit up a little straighter. He didn't disappear. He didn't spend his final decades bitter in a dark room, and he certainly didn't stop believing his voice mattered. He ran for President of the United States, twice officially, in 1992 and 2004, campaigning on campaign finance reform, tax reform, and ending the war on drugs. Knowing full well he had no real chance of winning, he ran anyway, using every debate stage and every interview he could find to say the things he thought needed saying, the same way he'd once used a movie camera. Around 2008, that old unfinished footage got a second life. He retooled the project into something he called Billy Jack for President, and later reimagined it again with plans for the character to debate a sitting president through cleverly edited archival speeches. It never got made, not really. But the fact that a man in his late 70s was still dreaming up new ways to make Billy Jack relevant tells you everything about how little giving up was ever part of his vocabulary. In his later years, he turned towards something quieter, the study of Jungian psychology. He wrote, he lectured, and he worked to help cancer patients and people in crisis process what he called the deeper stories of the human psyche. It's a remarkable image, isn't it? The same man who once threw punches on screen as America's most famous vigilante, spending his final chapter talking to strangers about dreams, myths, and healing. Somewhere, that's either the least surprising thing in the world or the most. In 2001, he was diagnosed with tongue cancer that doctors called inoperable. For years afterward, his own website insisted it was in remission. Whether that was medical fact or Tom Laughlin simply refusing one more time to accept somebody else's version of his story, well, that depends entirely on how well you think you know him by now. Tom Laughlin died on December 12, 2013, of complications from pneumonia at Los Robles Hospital in Thousand Oaks, California. He was 82 years old. His daughter called him simply and accurately a true American maverick. Dolores Taylor, his co-star, his creative partner, and his wife of nearly 60 years, passed away on March 23, 2018, at 85 after a long battle with dementia. They left behind 3 children, Frank, Teresa, and Christina, whose names Tom had quietly folded into his own screen pseudonyms over the years. Frank Laughlin, T.C. Frank, a small, permanent love letter hidden in his film credits the whole time. They also left behind a small, fiercely independent library of films that refused to play by anyone's rules, and a legacy of standing up for people who rarely had anyone standing up for them. Tom Laughlin lost his school, lost his fortune, lost his final film, and spent years of his life in courtrooms fighting for what he believed was his. But he never once lost the willingness to bet everything on doing things his own way. So here's the question we'd love to hear your thoughts on. Do you think there's an actor working today with the nerve to create an entirely original character the way Tom Laughlin created Billy Jack? Or has that kind of stubborn, one-of-a-kind creativity gone the way of the dime store hat? Let us know in the comments.